You learned to stay silent, and no one noticed the cost of it. You learned that in certain environments, speaking is dangerous, showing pain is weakness, and feeling a risk you can't afford. But what if I told you that this silence, the one you thought was maturity, might be the very thing that's killing you inside? Machiavelli understood silence not as a virtue, but as a weapon, not as wisdom, not as peace, but as a strategy of control. In any power dynamic, those who talk too much reveal themselves. Those who stay silent take control. Silence controls timing, emotional perception, and the outcome of a conversation. And this isn't just about politics, it's in our relationships, and more importantly, in how we relate to ourselves. How many times have you pretended to be fine just to avoid confrontation? How many times have you silenced the truth in your body because the environment couldn't handle the truth of your soul? Carl Jung once said that what you silence doesn't disappear, it just changes form. Silence, when it doesn't come from conscious choice but from fear, becomes a mask. Worse, it becomes a prison. You act as if you're at peace, but inside, there's a war without a name. Because you weren't taught to choose silence, you were taught to use silence to survive. This peace you feel, most of the time, it's not freedom. It's just the absence of conflict. And the absence of conflict is often just a hidden agreement with fear. You avoid the fight. You avoid saying no. You avoid the break. And meanwhile, whoever holds emotional power, a partner, a boss, a family, stays in control. Because you go quiet, and silence makes you disappear. The truth is, silence sustained by trauma doesn't protect you. It hides you. It pushes your pain beneath your awareness, until one day it erupts. Not in words, but in symptoms, in anxiety, in repressed anger, in existential fatigue. Those who know how to stay silent know how to dominate. But Machiavelli would warn you, dominating yourself might cost you your authenticity. And there's the trap. You think you're in control, but maybe you've just forgotten who you are. This introduction isn't here to comfort you, it's here to confront you. Because maybe your silence isn't wisdom. Maybe it's the most subtle proof that you were trained to vanish. You weren't born silent. You were made quiet by necessity. By the subtle, repeated message that your truth was too loud for the people around you, that your tears were inconvenient, that your needs too much. So, you adapted. Maybe it started in childhood, where crying only brought coldness, or in a relationship where honesty triggered rage, or in a home where peace was maintained by walking on emotional glass. And little by little, you learned, survival means disappearing. Not physically, emotionally. You learned to shrink your voice, edit your tone, calculate every word. Before you even knew what you felt, you already knew what not to say. Machiavelli would have called this brilliance. He understood that silence could be more powerful than speech, that those who stay quiet learn how to dominate the tempo of interaction, how to observe, wait, and choose the perfect moment, or no moment at all. But what Machiavelli saw as strategic, your nervous system learned as instinct. You didn't choose to be silent. You were conditioned into it. And now, even when you want to speak, your throat tightens. Even when you're asked what you feel, you freeze. Because for so long, feeling was unsafe. You smile out of reflex. You downplay your wounds like they're nothing. You perform calm while your chest screams in private. The silence that once protected you has become a cage, and you are the one holding the key. too afraid to use it. You start to confuse peace with absence of conflict. But that's not peace. That's repression. You convince yourself it's maturity. But deep down, you know it's submission. You haven't found your voice. You've abandoned it. And now, in places where you should feel free, you still feel like a guest in your own body, still apologizing for taking up space. Machiavelli would say, silence is your crown, but he'd also ask, is it really power if you had to trade your truth for it? You didn't become quiet because you evolved. You became quiet because no one ever told you your voice mattered. Because staying small was the only way you could feel safe in a world that didn't know how to hold your fire. And now, even in calm waters, your body waits for storms. But here's what they never told you. You can unlearn that silence. You can remember the sound of your real voice, not the one shaped by fear, but the one rooted in truth. And if this resonates with you, if something deep inside is whispering, "This is me," then this space is yours too. Subscribe to the channel. Stay close, because the ones who've been silenced the longest are often the ones who carry the most truth. Simulated peace as a product of emotional submission. There's a kind of peace that doesn't feel like peace at all. It feels like holding your breath indefinitely, terrified of what might happen if you finally exhale. It looks calm from the outside, quiet, functional, even admirable, but inside, something is decaying. Because that calm is not the result of healing, it's the result of silencing. It's the performance of balance, not the experience of it. Many live in this space daily. They go through conversations, dinners, marriages, careers, mastering the art of staying agreeable. But what they're really doing is vanishing, softly, systematically. This kind of emotional submission begins so subtly that most don't even realize it's happening. You think you're just avoiding unnecessary conflict. You convince yourself that you're choosing peace over drama. But the truth is, you're slowly being trained to surrender every time your truth feels too heavy to carry into the room. You tone yourself down to keep others comfortable. You become cautious with honesty. You measure every word like it's a threat. And in doing so, you create what looks like peace, but only at the cost of your own aliveness. Machiavelli would have seen this clearly. To him, any social structure that demands obedience in exchange for stability is not the moral achievement. It's a tactic, a structure of power disguised as harmony. In these dynamics, the one who benefits from the silence is always the one holding emotional dominance. It's not that the situation is healthy, it's that it's tightly managed. The absence of conflict doesn't mean connection. It just means someone has become too afraid or too exhausted to bring their full self to the surface. The danger here is deeper than emotional frustration. It's existential disconnection. You begin to lose track of what you even feel because your first instinct becomes, what do I have to say to keep things from falling apart? You start negotiating your voice, your needs, your instincts, until eventually, you're no longer deciding how to live. You're only reacting to how others expect you to behave. The simulated peace becomes a form of internalized censorship. And the longer you live inside it, the more foreign your own voice starts to feel. Real peace doesn't feel like suffocation. It doesn't require your silence, your compliance, your ongoing performance. It asks for your truth. Messy, imperfect, loud if it needs to be. Because truth, unlike silence, isn't interested in control. It's interested in freedom. And sometimes, the real healing begins not when you maintain the peace, but when you're finally willing to disturb it. When you let the surface crack. when you let your truth be louder than your fear. And if something inside you is waking up while hearing this, if this feels less like a video and more like a mirror, then stay. Subscribe to the channel. Like this video not out of habit, but because it reminded you that you still have a voice, a truth, a pulse beneath all that quiet. Manipulation through silence. The power of not explaining, not validating, not responding. Sometimes the most destabilizing thing a person can do is nothing. No reaction, no words, just silence. Heavy, deliberate, calculated. It looks like maturity from the outside. It even feels like restraint. But often, it's something much colder, a silent form of control disguised as emotional strength. This kind of silence doesn't come from peace, it comes from power. And it's often used to punish without appearing violent, to dominate without raising a single voice. You've likely been on the receiving end of it. You bring up something vulnerable, a pain, a concern, a boundary, and you're met with nothing. A pause that lasts too long. A look that says everything and nothing at once. No validation, no attempt to understand, just distance, emotional coldness dressed as calm. And suddenly, you feel like the irrational one. Like maybe you said too much. Like maybe your truth wasn't worth a response. That's the trap. Because silence, in this context, becomes a mirror, but one that only reflects your fear, not your reality. Machiavelli understood this mechanism with precision. He knew that the most effective way to destabilize someone isn't to argue with them. It's to withhold, to remove the emotional feedback that humans need to feel real, seen, anchored. In relationships, this kind of silence is brutal. It keeps the other person guessing, doubting, self-censoring. The silence becomes a fog that confuses boundaries and erodes self-esteem. And worst of all, it's socially invisible. Because how do you explain to others that what's hurting you is the absence of a reaction? This manipulation isn't always intentional. Sometimes people who are raised around emotional avoidance end up using silence as a learned defense. But that doesn't make it less damaging, because when silence is used not as a space for reflection, but as a weapon, it stops being a boundary and starts becoming a leash. The one who withholds controls the rhythm of the relationship. They decide when connection happens and when it's revoked. It's a quiet kind of dominance, but deeply effective. The danger for those on the receiving end is internalization. You begin to think the silence is your fault, that your emotions are too much, that your needs are illegitimate. Over time, you start to shrink. You ask for less. You express less. You become easier to love, but only because you've become easier to ignore. And that's not love. That's compliance built on the fear of emotional abandonment. What's terrifying is how familiar this becomes. How easy it is to normalize this emotional withholding as just someone's personality. You start explaining it away. They're just not expressive, or that's just how they process things. And while that may be true in some cases, when silence repeatedly causes you to question your reality, your worth, your voice, it's not a personality trait, it's emotional sabotage. Machiavelli would have seen this not as cruelty, but as brilliance. He'd call it a strategy, an invisible throne from which one governs without ever needing to speak. But the cost of that control is connection. Because power held through silence doesn't build intimacy. It breeds distance, suspicion, self-erasure. This kind of manipulation is hard to name because it hides in what's missing. And yet, its impact is felt deeply, in the tension of every unspoken word, in the weight of every unanswered message, in the hollow ache of being next to someone who's physically present but emotionally absent. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from swallowing rage your whole life. Not explosive anger, but that deep, burning sense of injustice, of having your truth dismissed again and again until you learn to bite your tongue before your voice could even form. At some point, you stopped trying to be heard. You convinced yourself that staying calm meant staying safe. And in doing so, you didn't just silence your pain, you silenced your power. This wasn't weakness, it was strategy. A survival tactic you picked up in environments where anger was punished and compliance rewarded. You became emotionally fluent in non-confrontation. You became the peacekeeper, the stabilizer, the one who always knows better. But inside, your rage never died. It just learned how to dress itself in quiet resentment, in fatigue, in migraines, in insomnia, in pretending to be okay when you were quietly falling apart. Carl Jung warned that what we repress doesn't disappear, it transforms. When you silence your legitimate fury, you don't become noble, you become divided. Your conscious self plays nice while your shadow self screams in isolation. And over time, the cost is not just emotional, it's spiritual. You begin to forget what your truth even sounded like before you started muting it to protect other people's comfort. But what if rage isn't something to fear? What if it's sacred? What if that fire in your chest wasn't a flaw, but a signal? A flare from the depths of your psyche saying, something is wrong here, and your silence is making it worse. We've been conditioned to believe that rage is dangerous. And it can be, when denied, when unintegrated, when it finally erupts after years of being buried. But in its raw form, rage is not chaos, it's clarity. It's your nervous system refusing to normalize what your soul knows is a violation. It's not destruction, it's data. But only if you have the courage to listen to it. This is where the shift begins. Because there is a silence that destroys and a silence that reigns. Most people live in the first, the silence of fear, the silence of trauma, the silence that erases identity to maintain the illusion of peace. But Machiavelli saw another kind, the silence of control, of patience, of strategy, the silence of someone who knows their own fire and no longer has to prove it. That's what real emotional power looks like. Not reacting out of fear, but choosing not to react because you've already confronted the chaos within. You don't explode because you've already integrated the part of you that used to beg for permission to be heard. Now you choose when to speak, when to pause, when to disappear, not as defense, but as command. This is where Jung and Machiavelli meet, in the alchemy of shadow and control, when you no longer suppress your rage, but no longer let it drive you either, when you can hold it in full awareness and still decide your next move. That kind of silence, it's not weakness, it's warriorship. So the question becomes, are you still silencing yourself out of fear? Or are you finally learning to use silence as your edge, as the sharp, sovereign boundary between you and everything that once tried to dominate your truth? There is a kind of silence that masquerades as avoidance, and another that operates like a throne. One is born from fear, the other from absolute control. And this is where silence reveals its true duality. For some, it is the cage. For others, the crown. Machiavelli understood this distinction with disturbing clarity. To him, silence was not passivity. It was precision. He knew that those who master their reactions, who withhold when expected to explode, who choose not to explain themselves, hold an invisible edge. Because silence, when conscious, becomes a weapon of psychological power. It doesn't just stop chaos, it redirects it. And in a world addicted to noise and validation, whoever controls the silence controls the frame. When you no longer need to be understood, you become ungovernable. When you choose to pause instead of defend, observe instead of react, you don't lose presence, you amplify it. Because now, your silence isn't fear, it's design, and people feel that. They don't know why your quiet makes them uneasy, but it does. Because silence, when intentional, creates weight. It generates gravity. It forces the other to sit with themselves in the absence of your performance. This is where emotional power begins to take shape. When your words are no longer driven by the need to be right, but by the clarity of timing. When your restraint is not suppression, but sovereignty. You stop being readable, predictable, and in that unpredictability, you stop bleeding power into people who only knew how to feed on your reactions. You are no longer explaining your boundaries, you are becoming them. No longer announcing your self-worth, you are embodying it. This is what Machiavelli meant when he spoke of ruling not through noise, but through control of perception. The less you give, the more they wonder. The more they wonder, the more they reveal. Silence, used wisely, reveals far more about others than any confrontation ever could. But here's the paradox. Real silence, the kind forged in emotional fire, only becomes power once you've confronted everything inside you that once used silence as escape. You have to earn this kind of calm. You have to face the chaos before you can contain it. Only then does your stillness become strength, not absence of emotion, but mastery over it. In this light, silence is not peace. It's not comfort. It's not surrender. It's the edge of your blade, the weight of your presence, the throne you sit on not because you're hiding, but because you finally understand. The loudest force in the room doesn't always speak. Silence is never neutral. It either erases you or empowers you. It either reflects fear or it commands presence. And the real question is not whether you're silent, but why. Machiavelli used silence not as refuge, but as calculation. He understood that words but silence alone is not power. It only becomes powerful when rooted in self-possession, when you're no longer silencing yourself to avoid rejection, but choosing silence because you already accepted who you are. When you faced your inner war and realized, not every battle deserves your blood, not every person deserves your clarity. Jung would remind you, what you repress will return. This is the silence, and that's the rupture. For most, silence has been a prison, but now it becomes your perimeter, a sacred space between you and everything that once tried to dismantle your center. You no longer use silence to disappear. You use it to choose what deserves your voice and what doesn't. So the next time you're quiet, ask yourself, is this silence protecting your fear or revealing your power? Because the moment you stop needing to be seen to know your own worth, you become the one no one can ignore. If this resonated, leave a comment. Let this space know you're no longer silent because you're afraid, but because you're awake. And if you want to walk com essa consciência junto de nós, subscribe to the channel. This isn't just philosophy. It's emotional weaponry, and you're not alone anymore.